All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the second day of our Narrating Cold Wars conference, which is organized by the Hong Kong Baptist University School of Communication and Film in collaboration with the Academy of Visual Arts and the Department of Government and International Studies. Yesterday, we had a very full day of what I thought were really amazing presentations and some really incisive and thought-provoking questions from the audience. And I expect it will be no different today. Those of you who joined us at the start yesterday might remember that I somewhat cheekily encouraged us to think of this conference as a kind of exorcism through which we can summon and expel the ghosts of the Cold War that continue to haunt and in some important respects limit our imagination. And so we have two panels this morning that deal in very different ways with trauma and what that might mean for humanity and its habitat, how the ghosts of our violent pasts might be constantly beckoning to us to return to the sites of our trauma. But a number of these papers also point to a different kind of spirit, a holier kind of spirit that could bind us together, inspire us into moral, even political solidarities through which we might change the world for the better. Now, I suspect something like this connects the papers in our first panel, and I'd like to introduce them to you before they present their papers. Two of them are with us at this time. We're still trying to contact the other two who may be experiencing some technical difficulties being based in the US, joining us. But the two who are here at this time, we have Milen Jissov, who is an associate professor in history at the BNU-HKBU United International College, which is based in Zhuhai, China. And he specializes in modern European intellectual and cultural history. Hello, Milen. Nice to see you. Welcome. And then we have Vinit Agarwal, who has a really interesting CV. He describes himself as an independent researcher. At one time, he was a full-time software engineer, and he's recently graduated from the Critical Curatorial Cybernetic Research Practices Program at the Visual Arts Department of the Geneva School of Art and Design, right? And he's worked on as a scientific, artistic research collaborator in projects on technopolitics, internationalism, and decolonization. So you're very welcome as well, Vinit. Nice to have you on our panel. We also have, and I hope they will be able to join us soon, we have on this panel Itai Sneh, who is an associate professor at the City University of New York, and he works on human rights, justice, American presidential, diplomatic, legal, and political history, international law, terrorism, genocide, Israel, and the Middle East. And he is the author of the book, The Future Almost Arrived, How Jimmy Carter Failed to Change US Foreign Policy. And we also have on this panel, Mary Ann Hauser, who is Associate Professor of History at Washington Baptist University. She does research on transatlantic solidarities dealing with Southern Africa. And she has written a book called Bureaucrats of Liberation, Southern African and American Lawyers During the Apartheid Era. So here are four speakers. Two of them are here now, and we hope that the other two will join soon. And I'd like to invite Milen to start us off. And before he does, let me also say that you in the audience, we really welcome your questions, and we have some time for questions at the end. And as is quite typical, don't wait until the last minute to pose your questions. I would encourage you to pose them, to type them into the Q&A box as soon as they come to your mind, so that we don't all rush at the end to try and answer many questions and not be able to do that adequately. So the moment you have a question, just type it into the box and we'll try to get to it once the presentations have been made. And the speakers too on the panel, I would also encourage you to interact with your fellow panelists. And if you have questions for one another, those would also be very welcome. So Milen, can we start with you? Welcome. Let's hear your paper. Oh, we need we need you to be unmuted, I think.
All right.
There you are.
Good.
And we want you to have your slides on.
Yes, I'm definitely ready to start. So before I do that, I would like to thank the organizers for this really wonderful conference. I'm very happy to have the chance to talk about the Cold War. It is related to my latest research, so I really do honestly and deeply appreciate the chance to share with everyone the stuff that I've been working on for the last year or so. So my presentation is basically a critique of one of the most famous books of the Cold War, and that is Czesław Miłosz, his book called The Captive Mind, which I'm sure some of you have read. So I have my presentation typed out, so I'll read what I've written. I hope the PPT will help you to follow what I have to say. So the title of my presentation is Strange Harmony, Human Nature and Tyranny in the Eyes of Czesław Miłosz. This is the person and the book that I'll be talking about today. So here we go. The middle decades of the 20th century constituted the nadir of modern European history. Political tyranny, embodied by Stalinism in the Soviet Union, and especially by Nazism in Germany, threatened to destroy Western civilization. At this darkest historical hour, Western intellectuals naturally sought to understand the evil of tyranny. One aspect of it that drew their attention was the subjectivity of the subjects of tyranny. One important thinker who probed this subjectivity was the Nobel laureate for literature Czesław Miłosz. He did so in his best-known work, The Captive Mind. Published in 1953, The Captive Mind is a critical, politically dissident, historical and cultural analysis of Eastern Europe of its time. Its main objective, as formulated by Miłosz, is, quote, to explain how the human mind functions, unquote, in 1950s Eastern Europe. Casting a critical look at the captive mind, this paper argues that Miłosz's analysis of the human mind in tyrannized Eastern Europe slips into a significant aporia. Probing how it captivates that mind, Miłosz shows inadvertently that the political tyranny over Eastern Europe corresponds to what he understands to be human nature. Ironically, he thus reveals that tyranny, Stalinist tyranny, exists in strange harmony with human nature. The purpose of this paper is to explore this paradox. The Captive Mind is a critique of the Stalinist political tyranny established in Eastern Europe after World War II. Miłosz terms that tyranny totalitarianism, quote unquote, and he minces no words in repudiating it. He calls it, quote unquote, stupefying and loathsome. In what is his main argument, he claims that the foundation of this regime is mind control. Eastern European totalitarianism, he asserts, imposes a quote-unquote mastery over the human mind. And it does so by enforcing a quote-unquote total rationalism on human thinking. Miłosz has in mind a specific kind of rationalism, that of communist ideology. He calls that ideology quote-unquote diamat, which is a shorthand for, quote, the revision of Marxist dialectical materialism by Lenin and Stalin, unquote. Miłosz insists that diamat is indeed a total kind of rationalism. It is a logically consistent system of ideas that imposes itself aggressively on human beings and their world. It locks up human thinking in the prison of its dogma. The mind is forced to work and to perceive humans, their past and their present reality only through the ideology. This is the quote-unquote captivity of mind that titles Miloš's book. In stressing this imprisonment of mind, Miloš implies that Stalinist totalitarianism abuses humans, that it twists them out of shape, distorting their rationality and suppressing any non-rational dimension of being human. Thus, Miloš's thinking on Eastern Europe's captive mind is related to the philosophical problem of human nature. Miloš, I argue, identifies properties of being human that for him undoubtedly exist. In other words, he articulates a conception of human nature and posits the existence of that human nature. I'm going to, in this paper, focus on only one aspect of what he thinks is human nature, basically for reasons of time. For Miloš, one part of human nature is what he calls our quote-unquote aesthetic needs. They belong to the non-rational dimension of being human that he suggests Stalinist totalitarianism seeks to crush. They include a, quote, need of harmonious forms, unquote, which is basically our desire for beauty. They also include a, quote, hunger for strangeness, unquote. And they consist too of a yearning for, quote, unquote, mystery, for a chance of experiencing something unexpected, quote, unquote, a surprise. Eastern European totalitarianism, Miloš stresses, has declared war on these impulses. Coldness stamps the architectural demeanor of its cities. The closure of small businesses, now seen as germs of capitalism, stamps out the once picturesque hustle and bustle of everyday urban life. Austere and uniform clothing gives people a standardized look. Conformist behavior down to body language transforms them into automatons. Beauty, strangeness, surprise are killed in Eastern Europe. Boredom reigns. This reign of boredom also victimizes art. The official doctrine of art, explains Miloš, is quote unquote socialist realism. And socialist realism for him is a devilish dogma. It, quote, is not merely an aesthetic theory, writes Miloš, but involves the whole Leninist-Stalinist doctrine. In the field of literature, it forbids what has in every age been the writer's essential task, to look at the world from his own independent viewpoint, to tell the truth as he sees it, and so to keep watch and ward in the interest of society as a whole, unquote. Socialist realism is highly detrimental to art as it demands a thoroughly ideological art that kills truth. By enforcing it, Stalinist totalitarianism stifles the aesthetic urges of its subjects. This is what Miloš wants to argue. While claiming that Stalinist totalitarianism abuses the human mind, Miloš also shows that that mind harmonizes with Stalinist totalitarianism far more than he realizes. Let us now look at this inadvertent puzzle. Surprisingly, Stalinist tyranny, as Miloš represents it, actually meets partway human's natural aestheticism. Miloš's ostensible claim is that Stalinist totalitarianism kills human aestheticism, as we just saw. His text, however, belies this claim and aligns the two. Thus, Miloš's text synchronizes Stalinist totalitarianism with our desire for mystery. Despite his great stress on its rationalism, Miloš represents the Eastern Bloc as mysterious. Quote, mystery, he observes, shrouds the political moves determined on high in the distant center, Moscow, unquote. The government of the Soviet Union, as he describes it, in other words, resembles a secretive, ghostly, sorcerous control center manipulating the entire Eastern Bloc. Mystery also inheres in the Eastern Bloc's ruling ideology. Diamat, writes Miloš, quote, is mysterious. No one understands it completely, but that merely enhances its magic power. Its elasticity, as exploited by the Russians, can result at times in the most painful edicts, unquote. Not comprehended and expounded fully, Diamat allows interpretation, misinterpretation, and manipulation. In Miloš's words, it is an enigma. Curiously, Miłosz himself acknowledges that this enigma is a source of Diomad's power of attraction, but he does not realize the magnitude of this acknowledgement. In describing the Soviet government and Diamad in the way that he does, he actually mystifies them, and by doing so, he aligns them with his conception of human nature. In his text, there isn't much mystery in Diamad's appeal. The ideology corresponds to humans' bent for mystery. All right, so yes, so basically I'm arguing that, you know, Miłosz is unwittingly aligning human nature with totalitarianism. That's the argument. So I should be able to finish in about 2 minutes or so, okay? All right.
As
So
you need, yeah.
The tyranny of Diamad corresponds to another human aesthetic impulse, which is our craving for quote-unquote strangeness. This affinity is also striking, given Milosz's stress on the aggressive dullness of the Eastern Bloc. But contradicting that emphasis, he also stresses that the Bloc's realm of tyrannical boredom is exceedingly strange. Indeed, for him, it is downright weird. He writes, quote, "The inhabitants of Western countries little realize that millions of their fellow men who seem superficially more or less similar to them live in a world as fantastic as that of the men from Mars," unquote. Here, Miłosz is mocking the Eastern Bloc. For him, it is an alien universe. In fact, he stresses this weirdness dramatically by foregrounding it in the preface of his book. In that preface, he confesses, and I quote, "If I have been able to write this book, it is because the system invented by Moscow has seemed and still seems to me infinitely strange. Any civilization, if one looks at it with an assumption of naive simplicity, will present a number of bizarre features which men accept as perfectly natural because they're familiar. But nowhere is this so marked as in the new civilization of the East, which molds the lives of 800 millions of human beings." Miłosz then approaches the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe as an absurd universe. For him, they come straight out of Kafka. By seeing them in this way, however, he also harmonizes them with what he sees as natural human aestheticism. Indeed, if the impulse to strangeness does belong to human nature, as Miłosz postulates, then his claim that the victims of Eastern European tyranny accept it as perfectly natural because they're familiar with it makes little sense. On his understanding of human nature, Eastern Europeans should accept their totalitarian reality, not because of its familiarity, but because of its absurdity. What is more, on Miłosz's understanding of human nature, Stalinist totalitarianism should be appealing naturally to outsiders, including Miłosz himself. Thus, how he finds it hateful rather than attractive appears itself rather bizarre. And I have a conclusion, which is about a short paragraph. Setting out to explore the Stalinist totalitarianism enthralling Cold War Eastern Europe, Miłosz shows inadvertently that Stalinist totalitarianism aligns with his understanding of human nature. By doing so, he naturalizes Stalinist totalitarianism. This paradox has important implications regarding understanding the character and history of political tyranny. In the captive mind, essentializing humans abstracts Miłosz's analysis of totalitarianism. Thus, the lesson we can learn is that postulating a putative human nature may well be an impediment to understanding the historical pathology of political tyranny. So this is the last point that I'm making in the conclusion, and I would like you to thank you very much for your attention, and sorry for the technical glitches. All right, thank you.
On the contrary, I think you were able to present this paradox at the heart of your argument in an admirably clear and succinct way. And not only that, I think you were able to demonstrate for us the absurdity of the tyranny of Zoom technology and how strangely attractive all of that seems to our human aesthetic sensibility. So thank you for designing all of that. Fantastic, thank you. Let's move on. Let's move on to the next speaker, and he is Vinit Agarwal. Welcome once again. Welcome. You're in Rajasthan at the moment, preparing for a major conference on salt. How fascinating that is. Can you tell us a little bit about it before you present your paper?
Hello, everyone. Thanks, Dr. Kenneth Poltan, Milen, and yeah, everyone joining in from different parts of the world in different time zones. So yeah, that's really great that to be part of this conference, really an incredible honor. So the exhibition that you mentioned, Dr.
It's in Gujarat, sorry, no, it's in Gujarat, not Rajasthan.
Yes. In Gujarat, yes.
Yeah.
It's called Salting Futures. It's about thinking about salt histories and the taxation which was there on the salt, but actually using salt as an interscalar vehicle then to really think about different commodity futures, which can be extended to any abundant thing, such as salt. So it helps us to think about oxygen, about water, and what would be the horizons of future if such a commodity were to tax, but also what entails the mechanism of what are the processes of colonialism when such a taxation is made. So we see like a whole sophisticated system by East India Company being put in place, actually a huge hedge that an important researcher, Roy Moxham, talks about. So that's all in making. Hopefully we'll see something about it next year. But
fascinating. Good luck with that, and let us know when it's ready for us to come and see.
Yeah, sure.
All right.
Thanks. So great. So today I want to talk about and take a little bit forward the conversation that Milen just proposed us, which is regarding socialist, feminist internationalism, seeing a space of liminality and possibility when these three horizons of socialism, feminism, and internationalism come together by reading closely a film by Indian filmmaker Chetna Vora, who made this film called OYOYO in 1980s. My key proposition would be actually to displace the binary that we see always in Cold War frame. So essentially, the Cold War is always framed between two polars, historically between US and USSR, or in the current parallels between US and China, or somehow in third space, being linked to UK, Germany, and such places, and actually claim a fourth space to see a possibility inside where different countries, as we would see in this film, different students from Ulaanbaatar, from Argentina, from Concepcion, from Guinea-Bissau, from India, come together to create a space inside these bipoles of Cold War. So the proposition would be actually to displace the binary polarity of the Cold War and see what are the other links that are available inside. And I'll be talking, or I'll be situating this in the frame of provincializing Europe as proposed by Dipesh Chakrabarty, a post-colonial thinker. So I'll begin reading a fragment and then I'll share my screen so that I can show you some fragments of the film as well. So this is a study of the politics of friendship towards feminist socialist internationalism as a concept by means of OYOYO. Chetna Vora, an Indian student from Palitana in Gujarat, who came to GDR in the mid-1970s, made two important films during her study at Babelsberg Film Academy. The first, OYOYO, was towards her third-year admission in the 1980s, and Women in Berlin towards her graduation in 1981. In OYOYO, Chetna interviews students from many countries about their parkour in a setting of hostel. This film is an archive at Babelsberg Film Academy and was shared to me from there. So this concept lies in vector to use and abuse concepts of solidarities, networks, rhizomatics, pattern-based thinking and alliances. As students from socialist countries such as Mongolia, Chile, India, Bissau, Cuba, Mali, Greece arrive in East Germany, and anti-colonial struggles and post-coloniality turn on a bipolar minus x to plus x axis of the Cold War period, the binaries get displaced. Towards an investigation of films such as OYOYO, we find that there is a coming together in desire, politics, and economics of not only the students from these countries, but also of anti-colonial, post-colonial, and anti-capitalistic internationalist concerns. Internationalism, then, is formed and processually constructed, frame by frame, in these films as a possibility that remains a liminality, a possible liminality that does not disappear as soon as the two ends between which the liminality resides disintegrate, but is sustained by the constant escape from realization. As the Cold War binary are displaced by socialist solidarities in anti-colonial struggles and post-colonialist reimagination. So I propose to read OYOYO as a liminal possibility and as an a priori condition for feminist socialist internationalism. Okay, hope you can see something on your screen and you can still hear me. Great. So these questions are placed as soon as the film begins. In the very first frame, where we see a set of multi-storied buildings horizontally laid out with a pathway between them. The structure closest to the camera makes an L-shaped invitation, taking us deep into the horizon of prefabricated buildings. Chetna Vora, with Lars Bartel, shot the film in a student residence in Berlin-Karlshorst. The building shown in this film, where most international students studying economy lived, does not exist anymore. This house, where the film is located and proposed here as a house of internationalism, is right at the center of multipolar politics of the Cold War. Berlin-Karlshorst is a special place whose traces we also find in a CIA report in 1950, actually filed on 16 April 1959. This report can be used essentially to resituate the initial markings of the student residence in Berlin-Karlshorst. The 60-point report includes a determinate account of each of these buildings, their security, capacity, architecture, and functions. A map of the area is also included at the end of the CIA report. So then we can think of how actually the binary Cold War apparatus that yesterday we saw Tyranny talking about and then came forward in Naeem's presentation as well, operates on this axis of minus x to plus x, and then how, and then we will see in this film how the binary apparatus can be displaced actually. In its abbreviated form, OYOYO was deemed acceptable, but not maybe plotting, but still maybe plotting a hidden desire. This compels us to read OYOYO as a cybernetic loop, between different poles, and a loop between constant acceptance and refusal, one that metaphorically reappears in the film from Windows. A window is a liminal place between the exterior and the interior, between the outside and the inside. What constitutes this outside? Outside the window is neither an active street full of people, nor a manicured lawn. Rather, all we see outside seem to be a site under construction, renovation. Through the use of a long shot, a construction and renovation, a practice that defines socialist realism, where the conversation about everyday life, the real time, as opposed to the cinematic time, and a radical openness works in favor of workers. There are many contexts that can be drawn from this image of a student looking outside the window in Chetna's film. This looking outside the window occurs as a marker of feminist politics that necessarily escapes any institutionalization. We can see it in frames of domestic public duality. We can read it in the image and biography of Chetna between East Germany and her return to India, or we can read it through a long history of internationalism and friendships that were hosted in between. The motive of looking outside the window thus seems to be a general index through which we can navigate the archive that is constituted in the film. The window aperture that unfolds this architecture becomes very specific if we consider the landscape that is making the vanishing point. This landscape, unlike in its form as a classical motif, is a structure in construction. The landscape is a microstructure of internationalism, we propose. And now to see the different poles inside this binary and how like the moments of hesitation that Naeem was talking about regarding this, and Chetna's intervention actually to displace the conditions in which the film is being framed, which is in a program, has to be televised and produced for television, and would need to carry out a certain program regarding GDR, gets displaced in the fragment. So I'll share the sound as well, and then you can see.
So, mein Großvater war von Indien gekommen, ja. Ja, er war der Vater von meinem Vater. Und er war Käufermann, ja, oder Kaufmann. Und er ist nach Indien gekommen, ich weiß nicht in welchen Jahren. Und mein Vater und meine Mutter ist dort geboren und ich auch, in Guinea-Bissau.
Und wie hieß er?
Mein Großvater? So, ich erinnere mich nicht.
Und du?
Ich weiß nicht. Er ist im Jahr 1955 gestorben und ich bin in 56 geboren, ja. So, ich kenne ihn nicht, ja.
Und wie heißt deine ganze Name?
Meine? Carmen Maria Barbosa Issa.
Ja. Und wo bist du zurzeit?
Ja, ich bin jetzt in Freiberg. Ich muss noch ein Jahr Deutsch wiederholen und dann ich mache Medizin in Halle oder Leipzig, ich weiß nicht genau.
Und dann willst du wieder zurück?
Ja.
Wohin?
Ja, nach Guinea-Bissau. Das ist fast 6 Jahre oder 6 Jahre Medizin, ja.
Ja?
Das dauert zu viel. Vielleicht 1983 oder 1984 kann ich wieder nach Guinea-Bissau kommen, ja.
Und wie ist dein Vater?
Er ist gut.
Der ganze Name?
Ja, der Name? Er heißt Filomeno Francisco Xavier da Piedade Issa. Ein Großname.
Erzähl mal.
Ja, ich weiß nicht, was ich erzählen kann. So, vielleicht vom DDR, ich weiß nicht. Ja, das gefällt mir.
Nee, zu Hause.
Zu Hause? Ja, ich bin die einzige Tochter, ja. Ich bin allein. Und ja, wir leben in der Hauptstadt. Ich habe 5 Jahre in Portugal studiert, ja. Und dann bin nach der Unabhängigkeit von meinem Land bin ich nach Guinea-Bissau gefahren, ja. Ich habe 3 Jahre studiert und dann bin ich hier gekommen. Ich habe noch 2 Jahre gearbeitet, 1 Jahr als Kindergärtnerin und 1 Jahr als Sekretär im Post.
Great. So we see this hesitation being built up when Carmen Maria Barbosa Esa, who is a student from Guinea-Bissau, speaks to Chetna Vora. And in this moment, when the script runs out and Chetna asked her to tell us something, Carmen proposes to speak about GDR. And then Chetna, intervening from her feminist internationalist perspective, proposes her not rather to speak about GDR as the program would ask, but indeed tell us about herself. So this intervention and such interventions in the film actually mark an important shift and sort of a subversion of what is intended rather from the film. So as I said,
Ich habe gehört, dass
as I said before, OYOYO was the pre-final year submission of Chetna Vora towards her thesis. Her final submission was Women in Berlin, Frauen in Berlin, which was made during Chetna's studies at Hochschule für Film and Function der DDR in Potsdam. But it was not accepted officially as a film that was finished at the film school. The production of Women in Berlin was cancelled by the HFF at the rough cut stage, and negatives were largely destroyed. The label on the back of the DVD copy of this film, Women in Berlin, states, Chetna managed, along with other students, to copy the cut on VHS. There was only one VHS camera in 1981 in GDR at the Volksbund Theater. The HFF called on to police to retrieve the rough cut, but didn't know about the VHS copy. After Chetna returned to India in 1983, the HFF destroyed most of the material and produced a 30 minutes version, which was presumably shown on TV on TDR. It is important to note this relation of OYOYO with Women in Berlin. Yeah.
I'm sorry to interrupt. It's just that if you intend people to read the subtitles, I think quite a number of people have pointed out that they can't see the subtitles. Do you intend for them to read it?
Yes, sure.
Okay, so yeah, might be a good idea to move. Yeah.
Thanks for pointing that out. So it is important to note this relation of OYOYO with Women in Berlin, in which Chetna interviews several women across generations, engaged in care work and conducting daily shows. It demands in no uncertain terms the proposed feminist socialist internationalism to be situated outside the frame of GDR as a single-party socialist state, outside any framing of what was made of institutions such as HFF. Indeed, OYOYO has a longer version of around 75 minutes, and this version that I'm showing you is around 47 minutes, available with the cameraman, Lars Pathar. The 45-minute edit of OYOYO, made against Chetna's willingness, was bound to the transmission of the film on television, where a time slot was reserved and an agreement was made with Babelsberg Film Academy to show the films on the state television. Finally, at 25 minutes and 25 seconds in this film OYOYO, a slow plucking of strings commences on guitar. We sense an arrival of a song, and everything upturns in this fragment. It is like a submarine, an underwater whirlpool that stays deep in the water as a potentiality that can come to fruition the moment you come into contact with the song. The song stays active in this coming together of students from Chile, Guinea-Bissau, the Mongolian Soviet Republic, Cuba, Bulgaria, and many other places. This song is Forti Tabaya Palagum, so much of working for other people. The song from which the title of the film is taken begins with the enunciation of OYOYO, OYOYO, which is a call together that we can understand from the methods of organizing through the call and response. A voice leads the music and the song begins in the film We hear people assembling in the gallery from their respective rooms and dancing together to the accompaniment of this song. With the guidance of Sonia Vos-Perkis, militant interdisciplinary historian and a longtime social political organizer, we could get more details about the song. Sonia informed us that the song is an old Cape Verdean music style called Finanso. The music group Os Tabaros performed this song first time, and the original name of the song is Kotitabaya Palagam. Sonia also generously shared the lyrics of the song that we use here in the subtitles. So I leave you with this fragment of the song and then move forward from there.
Possibilmente non mancare vocabolo che da fare, ma non evita. Guarda, è sempre il mio forza di tamina. Vai da parte del bagno, va a finire.
Social
I'll leave you there with this fragment of the song. Thanks, everyone.
What an amazing film and a terrific presentation. Thank you so much for that. Really appreciate that very much. While people are collecting or figuring out what questions they want to ask, oh, there is one actually, a factual question, which is asking you to remind them when this film was made. I believe 1980, is that correct?
Yeah, that's from 1980. And thanks, Noah, for bringing me to this conference, actually. It's Noah who introduced me to the conference. Thank you.
Wonderful. Terrific. What a great idea. And I mean, one of the motivations for that, I'm sure, is the kind of obvious resonance that your film has with Naeem's The Shortest Speech lecture, performance lecture yesterday. Whilst people are figuring out questions that they want to ask, I thought I might ask you actually to maybe comment a little bit more about those resonances, right? It's very clear, for instance, looking at some of the footage that Naeem presented yesterday, footage of a conference hall that's brightly lit, very exposed and compartmentalizing, in contrast with the dark corridors, almost formless corridors of a dormitory located in a space that's surrounded by construction work, right? And then the sort of, the disconnection in the clips from yesterday, the parceling out of little communities that didn't listen to one another, even though there was technology for them to do so somewhat adequately. They were not listening to one another. I guess you could say the very masculine sort of demonstrations in the footage yesterday, compared to these very organic communities, that were sort of enjoyed the company, enjoyed the music and the playfulness of it all, so much connectedness in the second, right? So I'll give you a little bit of time to think about that and maybe to comment on the contrast between yesterday and today. And whilst you're thinking about that, perhaps I might pose a question to Milen as well, which again is a very fascinating account of a very specific time in history, which clearly has many things to tell us about a much more universal and timeless question that especially political scientists like to think about, which is on the nature of tyranny, right? And how we might understand that. And we've been offered many theories for making sense of it, philosophy for making sense of it, empirical data for making sense of tyranny, and what freedom could mean in that context. I wonder, Milen, if you could say something about what you think the paradox that you've identified can actually tell political scientists about the theories that they continue and often desperately try to construct in order to make sense of something that hasn't left us even at the end of history. Oh, we need you to be unmuted. Is that something we do or you do?
Yes. Okay. Yes. So back online. So thank you for this question. Look, my immediate response to that is that what I think Miłosz's book shows is that really this kind of interpretative strategy of essentializing humans is the stumbling block to understanding political theory. So that's kind of the moral of the story of I think his book, and it's really amazing. I actually, when I first read that book a few years ago, I was absolutely shocked that he is analyzing, Stalinism essentially, but at the same time he's making comments and expressing ideas and reflecting on what it means to be human. And when you put these two together, you realize that the inadvertent message of the book is that Stalinism aligns with human nature. So it is a serious aporia in the book, and I think it very much destroys the book. Now, to me also, this project is like, when I think about the book and this, there is a factual question. The year of publication was 53, death of Stalin. Was it easy to publish this book in Poland at the time? Actually, the book was published in France. So yes, the year of publication is 53, but Miłosz actually, well, defected to the West in 51. So he spent about 10 years in France and then went to the US to work at UC Berkeley as a professor of literature. So the book was actually published in French. No, I can't remember if it was in French or Polish first. I think it was Polish, but then translated into a number of different languages. So it was actually intended for people outside of Poland. But to go back to my my earlier comments, I think when I think about this book and the problem in this book, I think one of the things that it shows us, a more general kind of implication, is that a lot of these books on the Cold War really need to be rethought, because they are heavily ideological, using concepts that are not, I would say, applicable or adequate anymore to understanding this whole historical period. And that also applies to the very concept of totalitarianism. As people have argued, totalitarianism is a Cold War concept in the sense of being biased and produced by the West and so on. So the very concept itself needs to be, I think, rejected, but at the very least rethought. Okay. So this is the kind of thing that comes out of this project, and this kind of essentialization of humans. It's amazing how it actually transpires. I'm a historian, transpires also in history books, and I think one of the blatant examples for those who are interested in history is Goldhagen's book, Hitler's Willing Executioners, which caused a huge scandal, and people blasted it all over the world 20 years ago. But in Goldhagen, you see exactly the same thing. Basically, what he's doing is he's trying to explain the Holocaust, and he's essentializing Germans. And the result is that his analysis doesn't make sense. So this kind of essentialization of humans is happening more often than we realize, I think. So that's kind of what, all of these thoughts are what came out of this project.
So let me just follow up on the question a little bit, and also maybe kind of follow up on Noit's factual question. The first one is, so to the best of your knowledge, where is some of the best work that's going on in terms of rereading these works, in order to, I don't know, de-essentialize or to rethink the appropriateness of concepts like totalitarianism? That's one. And then for Noit's question about whether a book like this, right? What was the reception? How was it easy to get something like this published in Poland? And I guess maybe was that paradox part of the reason it was able to be published relatively easily in different ideological realms?
Now, to answer your first question, I think good work is coming out.
Okay.
That about rethinking, for example, the concept of totalitarianism. I have a few articles. I can't quote them from memory, okay, but there is work being done on how totalitarianism is a limited concept. I published a couple of pieces on this as well. So I'm originally born and raised in Bulgaria, so the Cold War is very much a part of me. So I know that there is recent work in Bulgaria. There is a recent collection, for example, which I still haven't finished reading, by a group of scholars rethinking the whole communist legacy in Bulgaria. So I'm sure that other countries have their own work being done. Maybe it's too early for this kind of work to actually be completed, but there are good beginnings, I think, in that direction. Fantastic.
Yeah, go on.
Yeah, and the second question, again, the book was published in France, basically, and it was, when it was published, it received like rave responses from Western intellectuals. So some of them, Einstein said it's a good book, so it doesn't get any better than this for any book. So people in the West liked it very much.
Yeah.
Some people hated it, you know, so it was a mixed reaction. But yeah, it appeared in France, and I'm not sure. I think it was eventually published in Poland as well, but much later. I think in the 80s, when Solidarity came, and you know the Cold War started unraveling. But initially, it was a book published in the West, intended for Western audiences.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, sorry.
Go ahead.
Yeah, you know, the funny part is that also that Miłosz is, you know, he got his Nobel Prize for literature for his poetry, but actually he's better known for this book than as a poet. So that's one of the paradoxes.
Thank you. I think, did I see correctly? Is Itai?
Yes.
Itai Sneh is here, is he?
Yes.
Okay, so what I propose to do is to allow Vinit to respond to that earlier question that I posed, and maybe for about a few minutes, and then we'll get Itai to present his paper. But Mary Ann Hauser is not here.
No.
Okay, so go ahead, Vinit, if you don't mind. Oh, you need to. Can you?
Great, thanks.
Okay.
Yeah.
There you go.
I actually have a question for Milen as well, but maybe I'll keep it for later. Yeah, it's a great question, really. There are certainly a lot of takings that I take from Naeem's presentation yesterday, especially about the moment of hesitancy that I talked about, which is very pronounced. And it seems that Chetna constantly, not only on this film, OYOYO, but in her other film, Women in Berlin, as well, is very keen to keep those moments of hesitancy intact. The overall frame is obviously laid out. So it's a film that is made in a school program towards her submission of third year, towards the third year submission. And that marks us to think what is the frame that is being imposed, which is constantly encountered and subverted in the film. And actually, right before the fragment of the song that we saw, there's one person from Guinea-Bissau who says, let's give them what they want. They totally do not give them what they want. So essentially, to give them what they want marks us to think what is supposed as wanted, or what is supposed as needed or desired. And that framework of addressing GDR as a socialist internationalist space that it claimed to be, and enter into the decolonial and anti-colonial politics that is very much around in that time. And we saw in Carmen's addressal that many of the infrastructure, the educational infrastructure, are still to be built in the newly independent countries, such as in Bissau. And so she says that she's in, everybody goes out to study in her interview. So all of these different points lead us to think of this subversion that is planted there. And actually, I listened to this film, really like following the Stina Camp's methodology about listening to images. I listened to the film with closed eyes many times, to not knowing or understanding a word of German language, to understand actually what is there inside the sonic politics of the film as well. And it came out that when we translated this song, the song actually changes everything. So you are supposed to perform a solidarity of the students from different countries that are very well hosted in GDR. But when we see the lyrics of the song, they subvert it at the same time. So they claim this fourth space that I initially proposed, which is not a space provisioned by any of the polarities between US and USSR. It is not even the third space marked by East Germany, but it is the fourth space that they claim by subverting what is being desired from them from the third space perspective, and create their own space in which this outperformance of the song happens.
Thank you very much. I know you mentioned that you have a question ask Milen as well. And I see that Noit has a terrific question to ask also about the subtextures of everyday life and lived realities that you find in a film like OYOYO, and how we might think about about Milen, your situation, you know, whether these textures of everyday life might also help to enrich our understanding of. We might come back to that, but I would really want to get Itai, who has just joined us now, to present his paper. Welcome, Itai. And I think you come in at the right time. You come in at the right time because we're moving from one solidarity, one sort of a source of solidarity, to another. And in your case, it's the power of the human rights discourse to create certain kinds of solidarity. So if you don't mind, please take it away.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. I'm sorry for the misunderstanding about timing, but all that ends well is well. And good morning to Hong Kong. I hope you're all doing very well and enjoying a nice weather. And I'm really appreciative. This is like a wonderful conference. I have been able to zoom into other sessions, wonderful organizers, great debates, and I'm really learning a lot. So
Itai, could I ask you to turn your video on? I don't think we can see you. Okay.
Oh, sure. Can you see me now?
Yes, perfectly.
Okay, I'm sorry about that. Are you able to see me well?
No, you've gone off again.
Oh, okay.
Can you?
Let me try this part.
Okay, you're back. You're back. Yes.
Yeah. So welcome, and I'm really happy to be with all of you. And I'm going to make 3 arguments in this paper, and then I'm happy to elaborate on them, and of course take questions. The first is, this is about the political dimensions of the Cold War that are salient for today's human rights advocacy. The first one is the promotion and protection of human rights served as a unifying rallying point for Eastern Europeans during the Cold War. Indeed, human rights advocacy was effectively a form of transnational anti-communism. Second is political considerations of who was in the Warsaw Pact, such as Czechoslovakia and Poland, and who was not, such as Albania, Romania, and Yugoslavia, strongly affected how Eastern European and Eastern Europe was defined. Last but not least, the 1975 Helsinki Final Act, where the Cold War human rights standards became concrete, articulated, and subsequently proclaimed, was a symbolic and substantive embodiment for this pattern. Local groups in communist countries were inspired by the mention of civil liberties as a rallying call for action. For example, Charter 77 in Czechoslovakia, so that movement in Poland. Thus, Helsinki triggered a process of verification that was internal, that built trust in the veracity of international concern and subsequent protections for oppressed people under regimes. So, I hope I'm being well seen now. So, my point is that human rights can be a rallying cry for everybody. Human rights is something that everybody can agree upon, at least in theory, that there's a way to define who we are and what we aspire for through human rights. You can be a communist, a Democrat, a capitalist, a liberal, a progressive, a conservative, and still consider human rights to be what defines you. And especially during the Cold War, there were people, including behind the Iron Curtain, who were for human rights and for the advancement of human rights, but still pro-communist. For example, we all know about the Spring of Prague in 1968 that allowed, for a few months at least, people who were pro-communist in Czechoslovakia to support human rights such as civic liberties, civil rights, the ability to vote, the ability to be elected, freedom of speech, freedom of elections, freedom of expression, to be both for human rights and for communism. And that type of approach also went beyond other borders. For example, in Poland, those who supported communism could support human rights. And in addition, this is why I talk about transnational. There were many groups in Eastern Europe and Western Europe trying to collaborate to advance the cause of human rights, meaning that it wasn't just a matter between NATO and Warsaw Pact, which looks militaristic, looks ideological, looks something that cannot be approached, cannot be put together as one unit, but something that can unite. So it's not fragmentation, it's not conflict, but it is collaboration and a sense of reconciliation, that everybody can agree on the good points, of what should be, namely democracy, human rights, freedom, equality, liberties, and not as a negative point, which is against the regime. I'm focusing on that because it's very easy to fall into the trap that human rights is something that people only use as a sword, not as a shield, meaning that it's only used to against countries, against regimes, against parties, as opposed to a shield, which can be shielding people who are advocates and activists against persecution. So human rights should be seen as something which is positive and shields people, and not just something that used to attack opponents. I'm saying that because human rights is often perceived, sadly, by antagonists as being hypocritical. It's only used to advance your point of view, your perspective, your rallying cry for whatever cause you have, as opposed to something that can unite. And during the Cold War, that was very particularly important because being a human rights advocate was seen by many in Eastern Europe as being pro-Western, anti-communist, and that should not be the case. I'm saying that because these days in places like Hong Kong and other countries, there's lots of human rights advocacy that is pro-rights and pro-equality and pro-interest in these issues, as opposed to anti-regime, anti-nationalism. It should not be confused that human rights are something that's political, because human rights are principles, are an agenda, something that puts people together, and not something that's meant to fragment. So I'm repeating that point because I'm sad to say that some people misunderstand what human rights are. Now, this is where I talk also about the issue of the Helsinki Final Act. Helsinki Final Act is now almost forgotten because of the end of the Cold War and how it ended seemingly by the vanquishment, by the abolition of all communist regimes. But first of all, that's incorrect. Communist regimes did stay behind, and of course, people like Putin in Russia and other places, communism did not go away. It just stayed in different levels and different places. But most importantly, I'm saying that because the Helsinki Final Act of 1975 was a bridge between East and West using human rights. Human rights were a bridge, a transnational bridge between different groups, putting them together. For those of you who may not know, it was signed in summer of 1975 as a part of the Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe. It was thought to be the time of compromise. The West agreed for the permanence of borders, which was seen as a recognition of the partition of Europe, meaning that there will be no change of borders between, for example, East and West Germany, and of course, Poland, and other countries which benefited at the end of the Second World War from a change of boundaries, usually in their favor, at the expense of Germany especially, but also in terms of the regime. When the Second World War ended, as we all know, the Red Army, the Soviet Army, conquered Eastern Europe and did not leave. So those regimes, Poland, Bulgaria, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Eastern Europe, Czechoslovakia, all became part of the Eastern Bloc. And the Helsinki Final Act of 1975 basically said that this is permanent. This boundaries will not be changed, and practically speaking, regimes will not be changing. And now that looked like a big failure. However, we should highlight and focus right now on the other factor, the other part, other half of that equation, meaning that the Warsaw Pact countries, the Soviet Union in front of them, but other countries as well, like Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, East Germany, Bulgaria, Hungary, agreed to protect and promote human rights. At the time, it sounded like a very bad joke. Soviet Union, Soviet regimes, pro-Soviet regimes protecting, promoting human rights. And nobody took seriously that they would do so. And the thinking was that in exchange for recognizing their supremacy, they gave empty words. Now, that is wrong for three main reasons. The first one was that those words about human rights served to inspire local groups. The most famous ones were Charter 77 in Czechoslovakia and Solidarity in Poland, that contributed immensely to the end of the communist regimes by 1989, by the Velvet Revolution that toppled within weeks practically all the pro-Soviet regimes in Eastern Europe. Second one was that there were communist parties which were not really included, and I mentioned that earlier when I said so, about Yugoslavia, Albania, and Romania. These countries, while communist by nature, and some of them actually more oppressive than others, especially Albania under Hoxha, Yugoslavia under Tito, and even Romania under Ceausescu, these countries were not part of the Warsaw Pact. These countries were communist in regime, communist in theory, communist in practice, but were not anti-American or anti-Western. Indeed, they were expected in a potential European war to possibly fight on the NATO part, on the pro-American, pro-Western part. So their inclusion in that meant that it wasn't just about communist regimes who are anti-American getting a pass in exchange for empty words about human rights, but that all regimes in Europe recognized the need to have a more human rights and protect and promote human rights. Again, even in theory, but the point is that this was recognized throughout Europe. This is the Conference and Security and Cooperation of Europe, the mother of what is today called Organization of Security and Cooperation in Europe. And that organization served well during the Cold War as a forum between all the countries, East and West, pro-American, pro-Soviet, communist, democratic, etc. And now the OSCE serves as a forum to debate and discuss issues of the moment, such as Russia in Eastern Europe and Ukraine especially, and what is happening in Belarus and so forth. So this kind of forum, and that's my third point, is the forum was the message. The message was that there can be a place of collaboration and cooperation between all the countries. Human rights was one of the principles, but it was based on what you would call realpolitik, or a moral politics, not just human rights in terms of good forms and good norms and good principles to follow, but human rights as a bridge that everybody can agree upon, even if they're not enforced at the moment, even if it's not as simple as everybody's free and living in democracy like they were in the West, in West Germany, France, Belgium, Britain, etc. at the time, but that there can be a forum where all countries can participate together and resolve their problems and resolve the conflicts in a way which was more peaceful. So it's pro human rights, pro collaboration, anti-conflict, categorizing countries as bad or good. Every country has its own sovereignty and its own issues. And also it was not just pro-Soviet, pro-American, but also countries which were more neutral, especially, as I said, the communist countries which were not under the Soviet control, like Albania, Romania, and Yugoslavia, but also other neutral countries in Western and Central Europe, like Austria, for example, that were not communist, but had democracy, but were still not part of the Western camp officially. They were being neutral. So all this to say that human rights has a huge role to play in putting together different groups, those who are opposing each other otherwise, and those who consider themselves perhaps as adversaries, as opponents, but can come together in the name of less conflict, more deliberation, more recognition of mutual interest, and more development. Now, applying this, and the Cold War thankfully is over. It's been over for, by now 30 years at least, since the Soviet Union dissolved in December of '91, but there's a new Cold War. Let's be honest about it. Probably between the Soviets, Freudian slip, between the Americans and the Chinese. And the Chinese, which are obviously present in Hong Kong, obviously have different perspectives and different agenda, different ideology than the West. But that does not mean that there's not enough ground for collaboration. Environmental issues, as we just heard in Glasgow, there could be issues of piracy, could be issue of mutual interest in trade, and human rights can be an umbrella in which these issues can come together without judgment. The good news about human rights, that human rights are defined by international conventions. Most famously, we begin with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights of 1948, which was codified primarily into two conventions, 1966, International Convention on Civic and Political Rights, and then International Convention of Economic and Social and Cultural Rights. So when we talk about human rights, we have something concrete, both in custom and in practice. And these can serve as principles, as standards, as norms, as underlings, as the minimum safety net for everybody to agree upon. And this is where it can get more interesting, because most developing countries are more interested in economic and social culture rights. Most Western countries are more interested in the observation, promotion, and enforcement of civic political rights. But we can come together. We can find a compromise. And human rights helps find a compromise without vulnerabilities and without a sense of winner takes it all, or without a sense of loser. So I think affecting human rights, helping the agenda of human rights, can do at least two things. First, bring together countries which otherwise have problems without judgment. They can both support human rights, each can focus on something else, but they can agree human rights is good. Secondly, in terms of transnational, can be a way to help promote and protect human rights from other countries without a sense of loss of sovereignty. That groups and movements can come together in support of aid, of development, of democracy, without seeking to tarnish or to violate the sovereignty. That they both work on the same issues, the same projects, and so it doesn't make it easy for a country to say that they are against something, or it doesn't make it easy to say that these guys are traitors because supporting other countries and other issues, because they're working on mutual agenda that supports everybody. How am I doing with time, by the way?
I think we should probably end so that we can get to some questions.
Sure.
Is that okay?
So wonderful. So
yeah.
In conclusion, which is usually the best, sure, of course, you know, the best sentence in all panels is in conclusion. So in conclusion, human rights can be good. Human rights should not be a problem, but a solution. Human rights can put together politicians. Human rights can put together organizations. Human rights can put people, individuals who disagree on many issues, but would like to advance the cause of progress and peace and prosperity. Thank you very much, and it's a delight to be among you.
Thank you, such an honor. Thank you, and I'm also glad that the in conclusion that you uttered was shorter than the main arguments, which is not always a given. Okay, so we're coming very dangerously close to the end. I think we have about 6 minutes. I wanted to ask you, if I may, to maybe respond to a question about how large narratives, the big narratives like human rights and all of that, whether they continue to have the kind of resonance in today's world that it might have had in a previous time. And the reason I'm asking this is because we heard yesterday from one paper, I think it was John Way's paper, that he described how in an age of COVID, for example, right, people are much more attentive to the lived realities and the smaller narratives, right, the smaller stories. And those things seem to matter a lot more to people than the big narratives. I just wondered whether it's still, the grand narratives are still things that can excite and can mobilize and can inspire. But I also wanted to invite Vinit. So this is what I want to do in the next 5 minutes. Right? I'm going to ask Vinit to ask his question very, very succinctly to Milen, because he's wanted to ask this question. Then we'll turn to Milen and ask him to respond to Vinit's question and to Noit's question about everyday textures. And then Milen, I suspect you may have a question for Itai. And if you do, I'll invite you to ask that question, and then we'll end with Itai responding. How's that? Vinit, go ahead.
Great. I hope that I remember the sequence, but very briefly to pose that question. Thanks for your wonderful presentation, Itai. It's really fascinating. I think the question extends to both of you, Milen and Itai. It's regarding the notion of human in your respective presentation, and if that notion of human is stable. In the last scholarship, for example, from Sylvia Winter, she proposes the idea of thinking human as a verb, being human, where the idea of human itself is not settled. So as much as we think of the human nature, the freedom that is associated either in case of human rights or in the notion of humanity as such, how does that lie in relation to bondage and the fragmentation currently there in the notion of human self?
Okay, so we move to Milen now, if you don't mind. We have to unmute him, I think. Oh, he's gone off, has he? Oh, okay. Are you there, Milen?
Yeah.
Would you like to appear for us? And if not, then Itai, how about you respond to what I asked earlier and Vinit's question?
Thank you. Great questions.
Go ahead, Itai. Yeah.
So, sure. It's me, right?
Yes.
So it's very good about the narrative, given also the theme of the conference. I like grand narratives, but also like small narratives. I think grand narratives are going with global history, and this is where human rights is seen as a response to the Cold War, to the Second World War, to wars in general, where it's a remedy that gives a sense of a solution, a sense of empowerment, a sense of an agenda that everybody can agree upon, at least in principle, and then apply the details in more political ways. So grand narrative is human rights can help solve. Small or local narrative, it's saying, I think globally, act locally. Then in local issue, that's where people have to come together. And human rights, I think, it serves as a forum where people can come without judgment and express their narratives and perhaps reconcile them. I know that it's hard sometimes to reconcile narratives which are conflicting, but it's worth a try. There's a famous expression, and I grew up in Israel, and the peace process took a while. So people started complaining about all the diplomats who were going to nice hotels and conferences, and they were asked how much does this cost, and they said less than one tank. So when people come together and speak peacefully, they become friends, they understand each other. It might take a while, but it leads to solutions and definitely leads to more discussion, which is positive as opposed to negative. I'm rushing because I want to answer the question, the second question, which is interesting about individualism and a sense of humanity. Excellent point. And I think that one of the best things about human rights, which I did not explain in my presentation, and thank you for the great question, that human rights can be both collective and individual. Human rights is about humans as humane, as one at a time, living together, like as with each individual right, individual expression, individual liberty, while at the same time working as a collective. And this should not be a conflict, it should not be a contrast. Being a human means that you have your own aspirations, your own ideas, your own worship, but no man is an island, no person is an island. We're all born babies, somebody to take care and nurture us, but then we become part of a family, part of a community, part of a country. So these things can be put together, and I think it's a sense of humanity comes from the fact that we all work together towards solutions, be them starvation, war, floods, how to fight the environmental concerns, how to come together as something that is larger than the sum of individuals. So do not lose individuality, do not lose your collective identity, but work with them together.
Terrific. And exactly ended at 9:30. So we must call this.
In conclusion.
There's always a catch, isn't there? But I must thank you all, Vinit, Milen, and Itai. Thank you very much for joining us this morning. Very, very stimulating, so resonant, all of these presentations. So thank you. We will go for a 15-minute break, and we'll come back at 9:45 for part 2 of humanity, ecology, and trauma. So please join us again in 15 minutes time. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much.